Today on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, I'm going to share with you what it was like when Amanda and I started budgeting together. Our experience was far from perfect. Today's budget tip is going to cover what you should do if you end up overspending your budget in the middle of the month and you need to pivot. How do you correct? Our question of the day is going to focus more on weddings and elaborating on different ways that you can focus your wedding budget if you've got a wedding coming up. Lastly, we're going to talk about the ideal structure for communicating about your budget in marriage. How do you successfully, consistently, and persistently build the habit of budgeting as a couple and sticking to your budget? Please enjoy today's podcast. Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and I'm happy that you can join us today. I'm going to start today by telling you a story about when Amanda and I started budgeting together, not necessarily as a married couple, but we were engaged. Let's go back to right before the wedding, 3 months before the wedding. I was aware that Dave Ramsey recommended 3 months of practice budgets, basically giving yourself 3 months worth of grace at a bare minimum in order to let the budget start working for you. I didn't want us to be focusing on the struggles of the budget for the first 3 months of our marriage. I wanted us to already be on the other side of that. But here was the problem. We were about 1,000 miles apart as the crow flies while we were engaged. Being engaged long distance has its challenges, not the least of which would be starting to budget before we were married. In order to facilitate connection and communication, we FaceTimed each other each evening throughout the entirety of our engagement with very little exception. We figured we could work in 3 budget meetings over FaceTime as a part of just our regular calling schedule. And I thought this was a good idea. The problem was we had not combined our finances yet. And it was also going to be that 3-month period where you got to give yourself some grace. You got to accept that there are going to be some negative emotions, that it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of time. Because we weren't married and we didn't have things combined, we weren't looking at the same set of numbers. We had basically each made our own budget. It was like we were budgeting accountability partners, but we were going in with like a deeper intention to delve into each other's numbers and kind of vet them out. And we were trying to do this throughout the entirety of our personal budgets. And that didn't settle well when we weren't acting as a team, when things weren't combined. So I came into the budget meetings like fairly excited about them, thinking like warm, fuzzy, all right, let's make this like date night sort of thing. And that's just not the way that it ever went. We ended up just having a lot of back and forth that ended up incongruent. And we walked away from all 3 of those budget meetings leading up to being married with this like awful feeling in the pit of our stomach. Before I conclude the story, let's take a step back and say that we're coming up on the wedding now. It's the end of the 3 months of budgeting. None of it has gone really well, but we've tried. We've given ourselves grace, and we know that we're going to try it again the first month that we're married. So we got married. The wedding day was perfect. I shared a lot about the wedding preparation in episode 16 when I covered that budgeting stuff in the story there. We got all of our financial stuff combined, and we sat down for our first budget meeting as a married couple right after the honeymoon. I tell you what, I went into that budget meeting with lower expectations than I did on the first 3. I figured that it wasn't going to go well, that there was going to be a lot of practicing. I had prepped a draft of the budget. I presented it to Amanda. I had organized things. We went through it. It ended up being a little longer, but when we were done, we had an agreed on mutual plan. We didn't end up picking on each other for anything that wound up in the budget, be it something that I put in there or something that Amanda put in there. And I walked away from that budget meeting on cloud 9. It went well, and we stuck to that budget. Sure enough, on the other side of 3 months of practicing was something that had a lot of grace behind it. I don't know if it was the grace that we received in actually being a married couple. I don't know if it was the practice that we put into it. I don't know if it was the combining of finances that led us to having a more unified sense about the budget meeting. It could be a combination of all 3. What I do know is our intentional preparation for being good budgeters in marriage worked. And it can work for you. I know it can. I know that the communication that we've been able to exercise through the budget has been instrumental in developing and growing us spiritually and emotionally as a married couple. We have matured significantly by diving deeper into everything our money touches and making sure that our treasure is truly going where our hearts lie, making sure that our virtues and values are reflected in what we're doing with our money. And beyond that, the trust that we've developed with each other has deepened beyond anything that I can put into words. I don't know how to explain it other than telling you that you need to experience it for yourself. If you're married, if you and your spouse are married, I urge you to try budgeting for at least 3 months. I know that it's going to be hard. I've been through it. It's tough. But on the other side is grace beyond explanation. Our budget meetings have blessed us immensely through thick and thin, whether we were making a lot of money in a given year or just barely making ends meet. We've been able to get through all of it with the same level of confidence, trust, communication, consistency, and frugality. With that, let's move on to today's budget tip. In the story, I talked about grace. I talked about how you have to give yourself 3 months of grace. Well, there are going to be months where your budget's not perfect. There are going to be months where you just didn't make it. There are going to be months where you overspend particular categories or something unexpected comes up and just drops a bombshell on your budget. When you go over budget or something unexpected blows up the budget is not a fixed finite thing that is broken like a glass bowl. The budget is a living, breathing document that can be changed. The trick is that when you make a change, you make it intentionally. You have a reason for making that change. And if you're married, you make that change together. You make that change in a way that both of you know what's changing and why. So don't be afraid to make changes in the middle of the month, to go through the budget and say, okay, we messed up here. Let's fix it. Where can we pull money to cover what was overspent? And how do we prevent ourselves from overspending in the future? This is going to be the mid-month budget meeting. The mid-month budget meeting pops up anytime you're going through the month, you update your budget and you say, well, we forgot about this or we overspent on that. And we need to make a correction. By making the correction, instead of shattering the glass bowl, instead of ending the month right there and then digressing into unintentional spending on a whim, and just saying, well, we'll just let it go and we'll figure it out at the end of the month. What you're doing is you're pivoting and making an intentional change that still keeps you on track with your hopes, dreams, and goals. It also helps you and your spouse communicate about the change before that overspending goes sour. And if you're able to address the issue promptly, right then and there, no matter whose fault it is, no blame, no shame, this is the game. We are moving forward. We're going to fix it and we're going to stick to it. That's how you grow in budgeting together. You have to be willing to be flexible with your budget so that it can change as conditions throughout the month change on you. You are proactively choosing what you want to be doing with your future and doing so together instead of reactively mourning the loss of what could have been or what you thought was perfect. With that, let's move on to a question submitted by you. Today's question comes from Rachel. Rachel says, I liked episode 16. Can you expand on the different types of weddings there are? I'm doing a destination wedding. Thank you, Rachel, for sending in your question. In episode 16, I covered wedding planning and how wedding budgets can help you learn how to budget. And later on in the episode, I dive into the nuts and bolts of a zero-based budget. I talked a lot about my wedding planning that Amanda and I engaged in, and how we were able to take the wedding budget and channel our values and virtues, what it is that we wanted out of our wedding, and have the budget reflect that. In order to address the question with the budgeting mindset, I'm going to break down weddings into 3 dichotomies, into 6 types of weddings, if you will, and share what, if it were me in your shoes, what I'd be thinking about as I was starting to write the budget for these weddings. The first 2 types of weddings we're going to consider are big weddings versus small weddings. If you have a lot of guests and you have a small budget, this is something that Amanda and I ran into. We had a finite budget and we wanted to maximize the number of people. Well, that involved minimizing the cost per guest. Probably the biggest cost consideration when it comes to per guest expense is going to be the meal. When Amanda and I did our wedding planning, a buffet style was ultimately going to cost more than having the meals plated and brought out to the guests. And that seemed weird to us because plated meals and having the staff on hand to bring all the guests individual plates. Well, that seemed like it was going to be a fancier event than having everyone go through buffet style, but there's going to need to be more of everything made buffet style for the sole purpose that you don't know which guests are going to grab which food, and people are going to want to come back for seconds. So it becomes more efficient to have the food plated, at least in the situation that we ran into. So to reduce cost per head, we ended up having a plated meal. I did go to one wedding that had a fair-sized guest list, and it was on a shoestring budget from what I know. And they didn't even have a meal. They had pretzels, they had nuts, they had M&Ms, and they had little plates where you could fill up snacks, but the reception ended at 3:30 or 4. You didn't end up having to feed every guest. Dinner was the responsibility of your guests after the wedding. While Amanda and I wanted to provide meals for all of our guests, it's not something that you have to do. Let's consider if the guest list is intended to be much smaller. If you have fewer guests, you can afford to spend more per guest. The other thing to think about is if you have a smaller guest list, your options for venues might be more plentiful. There are going to be more venues that can accommodate your wedding and the total guests that you plan to have if your wedding is smaller. If you get really picky about the aesthetics or the location of your venue, you might consider having a smaller guest list for the sake of making that venue work for you. In certain areas, if you want to maximize your guest list, you might leave yourself with a handful or fewer venue options. The other thing when it comes to a smaller guest list is just because the guest list is smaller doesn't mean that you necessarily have to spend more. It just means that you can. Let's move on. Rachel, you mentioned that you're having a destination wedding. So the next dichotomy is going to be a local wedding versus a destination. I remember looking up statistics on guests and RSVP rates locally. I think I found or figured or used at the time. Now, I got married just before COVID, so the numbers have probably changed. But local weddings had an RSVP rate for the area I was looking at of around 70%. 3 out of every 4 people that you invite you could expect to RSVP. And it's not a hard, fast rule. If your family is die hard about being there at the wedding and you're mostly inviting family, you're probably going to have a higher percentage. Or if you invite more friends who are scattered throughout the United States, you'll have fewer. But it's a baseline to start. A local wedding, you're going to probably have more people be able to attend than a destination wedding. It's inherently going to be more expensive for your guests if you have a destination wedding. So you can probably expect 30% or fewer of your guests to be able to make it to that destination wedding. In effect, you could probably invite more people, but know that your actual RSVP list, the actual number of people who will attend the wedding, will be smaller. A good wedding planner could help you figure that out. And that's the other thing. If you have a destination wedding and your destination is somewhere that you're not necessarily familiar with, it's a place that you haven't been or haven't been to very often, a wedding planner would probably be worth their weight in gold in planning that wedding. They're going to be able to know the area, know the timing, know the traffic, and think of things that you're not going to be able to think of if you're trying to DIY a destination wedding. If you have a destination wedding and your wedding party is expected to be there, big wedding party or small, it is expensive. It's more expensive for your wedding party to be involved in the wedding. If it were me, I would consider more so than I would with a local wedding, trying to help them out financially with either the travel or accommodations at the destination so that it's less of a financial burden for them to be a part of your big day. When Amanda and I were planning our wedding, we used the not sponsored by the way, to build a website. And on the website, people could RSVP. They could look at the meal options. They could read a little story about us. They could see engagement photos. We even had a list of accommodations where people could stay. But the Knot, by default, had a section where you could put like stuff to do where you're getting married. Well, where we got married, there wasn't like a whole lot of stuff to do, and it was local. We had a local wedding. We didn't have a destination wedding. So we thought that was kind of silly, and we omitted that part. But if you have a destination wedding, well, the destination wedding is like a vacation for your guests. They are planning their trip around that, and they're probably wanting to make the most out of that travel to your destination. There are going to be things that they want to do. So you might, if you put together a website or in the invites, list some of the cool things that they can do to capitalize on their time, either before or after your wedding. I think providing them with accommodations or discount codes and then a list of different things to do can be really helpful when you're doing a destination wedding. Last, I want to consider the dichotomy between traditional and original weddings. Now, this isn't like hard and fast. There are weddings that are like 100% traditional. It's exactly what you expect. It is the wedding that you see in the movies, and there's no deviation from cultural norms. It is running with the crowd and doing exactly what the parents of both sides of the family expect. But there are also going to be very non-traditional weddings and things that are original, more or less creative ways that the couple is expressing their marriage. Amanda and I did one thing that was pretty creative. We decided to, instead of doing some sort of symbol of unity like the sand, where you pour sand into an hourglass or into a frame, we ended up making a paper mache volcano that, instead of being just the typical baking soda and vinegar sort of thing, used hydrogen peroxide and soap and yeast. It's an experiment that your chemistry teacher might refer to as elephant toothpaste or elephant snot. And you pour them together and the volcano erupts and it's like really frothy. And the result is just really soapy water. And it was something that we thought would be really fun to do. We poured the two different things in. It erupted. It wasn't like a huge eruption, but it was fun. And we had a whole bunch of kids sitting down in front of the table where we had the volcano. Amanda had a lab coat over top of her wedding dress, and I had like the big sciencey goggles and a mad scientist wig. It was pretty fun. That's one of my favorite pictures that came out of the wedding reception, was us doing that. And so that's something that you can do. The thing is there's a thing called wedding tax, and wedding tax is typically going to be associated with some of the more traditional stuff. If you go to a florist and you buy flowers for Mother's Day versus flowers for a wedding, they're probably going to charge you more for the flowers for the wedding, because, it's a wedding. It has to be perfect. There's a little bit more pressure. It's wedding tax. So when you start going down the list with the decorations, the florist, all the different things, the wedding tax can add up. But if you go with something that's a little bit more original, something like the baking soda volcano, or something that is just out of the box and unexpected, well, it might not have a wedding tax tied to it. So the more creative, the more original that you can be with certain parts of your wedding, the more you can avoid the wedding tax. Don't be afraid to be you. Rachel, I hope that answers your question. I hope you find that elaboration and expansion on weddings to be satisfying. With that, we're going to roll into today's main topic. In married life, with personal finance, you have two people who love each other very much. They're, in a lot of ways, similar. That's how they connected. But in other ways, they're opposites. And in the way that spouses are opposites, we find that opposites can either butt heads or work together like cogs in a wheel. It's important to understand that your spouse doesn't approach personal finance or budgeting decisions the same way you do. It's important to realize that you and your spouse are different. And I know it's like, well, that's obvious. I'm not them and they aren't me. But you feel that way a little bit early on in marriage. You feel like your boundaries are let go and you become one in marriage. But in all reality, there are still things that keep you different. And those differences are designed to balance you out, to help you make wiser decisions and work together in a way that your personal existence, your personal extreme, that is an opposite from your spouse, can be brought together somewhere in the middle where compromise meets. And in this middle ground is where the best decision can be for you as a married couple. It could end up being the best place for decisions that you could make as an individual too, but without your spouse to bring you there, well, you might not have ever even thought about meeting in the middle on particular topics. So in budgeting, from my personal experience in my marriage and in the experiences of the clients that I've worked with, there's one spouse who typically likes the budget a lot, and there's one who doesn't like it as much. That's not to say that they dislike it. They don't have to dislike it. But the spouse over here definitely likes the budget more. And, they can dislike it. The spouse who really likes the budget is lovingly called the nerd. And the spouse who would rather not is typically the free spirit. The free spirit, nerd and free spirit, that's a little abstract. The nerd is going to be the organized, analytical, alphabetize the shirts in the closet, sort them by color. The spices are all labeled. Everything is like neat and ordered. Spreadsheets are something that they will watch a 30-minute video about. On the other hand, the free spirit over here is someone who's going to be more likely to use the sniff test, more likely to go on a spontaneous adventure, more likely to engage with something on a whim, something that is outside of their comfort zone, something that gets them excited, a little bit of an adrenaline rush. The problem is that spontaneous free spirit doesn't like to sit and stare at the numbers nearly as long as their opposite. So if you were to take these two and tell them, okay, I want you to sit down and write a budget, one of them is going to love it. Like me, I wanted it to be date night when Amanda and I were starting budgeting. It's like, break out the wine and cheese, let's sit down and let's just like stare at the spreadsheet for hours. And Amanda had other things to do with her time than waste date night in front of a computer. It just does not appeal to her. And for the free spirit, sitting there for an hour or two just talking about numbers is like pulling teeth. And we as nerds, heart to heart, nerd to nerd, we need to realize that our other half doesn't like sitting there looking at the numbers. They don't want to spend hours doing it. But you can, and it's okay. And they love you for it. We often in marriage are going to project what it is that we like to the person that we love. If we're the nerd and we love working with numbers and we get a lot of joy out of that, well, we want our spouse to experience that joy. So we want to spend a lot of time with them, getting that enjoyment together. And if you're the free spirit out there, you realize that sitting in front of the budget for hours and hours is not fun to you. You want your spouse to have fun. So you don't want them sitting in front of the computer. You don't want them sitting in front of the yellow pad working on the budget for hours and hours and hours. But you got to realize that they're having fun. That's what they want to do. So the structure for budgeting in marriage works best like this. The nerd really does enjoy sitting there in front of the numbers. The free spirit needs to let their nerd just run with it. The nerd's job should be to look at the numbers, get things reconciled, do a lot of the brute force effort, if any of that exists. There are certain budgeting tools that take a lot of the brute force effort away, which means that the nerd can just sit there and like absorb and think about it. Like just really deeply dive into the numbers in their own mind and daydream about what they might mean. And by the time they're done sitting there thinking about it, they can go to their spouse. You can go to the free spirit nerds and say, I have thought about it. I have drafted the budget. This thing is ready to review. Here's the problem. Your budget isn't perfect. Gosh darn it, you are only one half of the marriage. You need to take it to the free spirit and concisely present it to them. Remember, your free spirit, your other half does not like sitting there thinking about the numbers, being hypnotized and mesmerized by every little bit of addition and subtraction. They want to know what it is that you've put together, if goals are on track, and if their wants, their desires, and their needs are reflected in the budget. You need to show them that. You need to do it in the way that is most concise. You need to be effective as a communicator. It's a great way to exercise your understanding of the budget. Einstein used to say, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And that's going to be true with the budget. So get to the point where you can explain it quickly and simply to your significant other, to your spouse. Now, free spirits, you receive this information as quickly as possible. It might not be as fast as you would like it to be. It might not be as efficient as you wish it could be. But know that your nerd is trying their best. They love you, and they've put a lot of effort into laying down this draft of a budget and trying to think about what's going to be best for you and them this month. They didn't do a perfect job. They're going to forget things that matter to you in your heart. Nerds, you need to accept that you forgot something that your spouse is going to remember or think about. In my case, it's oftentimes gifts for birthdays or traveling or events on the calendar that were on Amanda's calendar, but not my own. And no matter how hard I think about it, as I'm sitting there thinking of the numbers, I'm going to forget something. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at last month's draft and basing it off of it, and last year's and the year before that, I'm going to forget something. Free spirits, it's your job to bring it up, at least one thing that you want to change or that needs to be added to the budget. And when your nerd says, okay, we can do this, we can change the budget, we can work that in, Well, that's when another decision needs to be made. If you move money into that category and the draft was zero-based, well, the money has to come from something else. And this is where the true beauty of the budget comes together with the budget meeting. You get to decide together what is the next most important priority other than what we're putting the money toward that needs to have money come out of it in order to fund this. It might be one thing, it might be multiple things. It might be the lowest priority on your list. But you need to ask yourself what it is that you can take money away from. Nerds, you have your savings goals. You have your priorities lined up for where money needs to be saved in order to make goals match in your sinking funds, to make goals happen by the due dates. And free spirits, you need to realize that you can't take away from some of those things if you care about those goals. You need to realize that your nerd has goals in their heart that matter to them, and you might need to let them have it, even if it doesn't make sense to you. Go back in the podcast, I talk about a TV. That was the thing for me and Amanda. For both of you, it's the same thing. You're going to have things in there that you don't want to touch. And there are going to be things in there where you can agree on, okay, let's move this. Don't be afraid to make a suggestion, and don't take it personally if they suggest something that, you really don't want to have change that is actually, in your opinion, the bigger priority. Talk about it. Know that you're both coming from a place of love and collaboration. What it is that you decide to change together in that conversation reveals what your heart desires. It reveals what matters to you on the budget, and it allows you to open your hearts up to each other. Listen to the other heart, and then speak what's on your mind in a way where I don't know any other place where this context can happen. And there's so much growth to be had in engaging in this type of conversation. After you've practiced it, your budget meetings last 15 minutes or less. And there might be almost no talking by the time you all get into a rhythm of this, but your hearts have grown together so much more so than they otherwise could have. I want to leave with one other thought, though. It's important that couples in marriage maintain a level of independence that allows them to not feel dependent on the other. I've mentioned it before. I'm reading the book, The Road Less Traveled. It's a psychology book that approaches psychological growth from a position of love. The author talks about how in marriage, having an unhealthy dependency between spouses, it could work one way or both ways, leads to a position where you remain together, you remain married, simply because you have to, not because you want to. It's kind of like the way that debt takes away your decision or your freedom of time, what you want to be doing with your future. It promises your future away. Becoming overly dependent on each other can lead to that feeling of constraint in marriage. And while, this isn't like globally perfect advice, I think there's a lot of wisdom in it, and I want you to hear it. If you zoned out while I was going on and on about numbers, focus back in here. Focus back in. There needs to be an understanding that your spouse can function perfectly without you when it comes to this money stuff. Free spirits, this is going to be hard because you don't want to. But you need to be able to express the fact that you can. It might be healthy every once in a while for you to lead the budget draft, but you don't have to do it every time. You need to not become overly dependent on your nerd to manage the finances. Nerds, it's important that you don't make this budgeting stuff so complicated that your spouse cannot understand it without you. You need to make it so that you both know what is in front of you. You need to both realize how things are set up so simply you could explain it to each other. If this is something that you found insightful or interesting, I talk about budgeting in marriage, managing money in marriage in depth. I have a workshop that is designed to be hosted at churches. It's available on the website. It is called Your Marriage, God's Word, and Money. If you want to see this workshop, if you want to be a part of it, talk to your local church. And if you don't have a local church, find a church in your area and tell them about it. Give them the link to the HopeFilled Financial website. Under there, you'll see workshops. And it's right now the only workshop. It's our first workshop that's listed on there. They can either have me come out and facilitate the workshop in person, or they can have it facilitated through web-based means. And it's something that can help not only your marriage, but every marriage in the community that gets to be exposed to this life-giving information, this life-giving workshop that makes genuine, real change happen for a greater good. When it comes to finances and marriage, this workshop is designed to help struggling marriages survive and good marriages thrive, and it is my wholehearted passion to see that happen everywhere that it's desired. Next week, we're going to take a break from the budgeting stuff. We're going to deviate because I saw an article that was published by The Hill. It talked about how 40% of millennials still are expressing a serious financial dependency on their parents. We talked today that having a dependence on another loved one is a way to basically hurt the relationship. So next week, we're going to be talking about boundaries between adult children and their parents, specifically the ones that are talked about in this article. And we're going to explore healthy financial boundaries that extend outside of your household. Until next week, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.